We have minimal troops there at 2,000, 1,900, whatever it is. And they're keeping 9,000 ISIS people in prison is critical. So with that.
Glad to hear that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Ricketts, you're up.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As we see what's unfolding in Syria, we know that the ramifications are from Putin's war in Russia. His miscalculation there is rippling through the system. We see it in Nagorno-Karabakh. We see it here in Syria, how he was not able to support the Assad regime. But we know in years past that Russia was critical to keeping Assad afloat and basically responsible for killing Syrians. And so with HTS victory, Russia has been set back on its heels. And we discussed, or you mentioned, Mr. Singh, the Russian naval base in Tartus. You've got the Latakia air base just outside there. So Russia's got some key assets. I think they moved some equipment out of the Latakia area, but obviously that was how they were doing their power projection, and they've had to really flee with their tails between their legs here. And the question is, what will happen going forward here with regard to how will Russia engage? I mean, al-Shara has got to stabilize his country. He's seeking legitimacy both internationally and with his own people. How is this all going to play together with regard to the role of Russia? Will Russia be completely kicked out? Obviously, things like oil, grain, even military weapons is something that Syria is going to need. They've been getting that historically from Russia, but recently we've been reading reports that the Europeans have been in conversations with al-Shara about, again, lifting some of the sanctions, and one of the conditions being kicking the Russians basically out of their naval base and the air base. So what do you see as the role for us in this? Should we be making that a condition of lifting our sanctions as we look at this, that the Russians have to withdraw? And what's the practicality of that? Can you just kind of give us an assessment of what you think we should be thinking about with regard to our sanctions and Russia's presence in the military presence in these naval bases?
Sure, thanks a lot, Senator. And look, you're right. I mean, Russia has had, even going back to Soviet times, a long-standing relationship with Syria and with the Assad regime ever since Hafez al-Assad took over in 1970. Assad was Moscow's guy. He was also Tehran's guy, but you see where he ended up. He ended up in Moscow. And that's how close that relationship was. At the same time, my sense of the Russians has always been that they kind of view Syria as their last bastion, as it were, of their influence in this region. And they're going to be loath to give that up. And we already see, as several of you have mentioned, a pretty sort of high tempo of engagement between Russia and this new transitional Syrian government. I worry, frankly, that it's a higher tempo than ours or the Europeans, or even the regions. The Russians are really going to Damascus, and the Syrians are coming to them. And part of that, I think, is due to the fact that you have this integration of sort of Russian stuff, as it were, into Syria. You have defense equipment, you have energy facilities, and so forth. And so, you know, if you've got this military equipment you've captured from the Assad regime and it's Russian, well, you're going to have to turn to the Russians, perhaps, to service it, to update it, and so forth. We have to somehow kind of put a wedge into that. And so I think part of that is going to be carrot, and part of that is going to be stick. The carrot part is obviously we're going to, through this kind of patient, pragmatic engagement and setting of benchmarks, which Ms. Struhl also talked about, hold out the prospect of Western cooperation. I do think it should be conditional. And I do think one of those conditions has to be, look...
If I could just interrupt you for a second. So
yep.
When you say Western help, you're also saying Western military aid?
So we have
weapons and equipment, that sort of thing?
We have sanctions preventing that now, and I think those will probably be some of the last we'd want to consider ever lifting. But I think you have to hold out the prospect that there could be, under the right conditions, a much more robust relationship across the board, a security relationship, including security broadly defined. But it has to. If that's ever going to happen, they can't also be hosting Russian forces. But I think that there's a stick side of it as well, which is where the sanctions come in. And my own view is we need a phased and gradual withdrawal of those sanctions, and we need to see performance on this issue in addition to others. I would just say don't leave out of this conversation the Chinese, because they supported Assad in other ways through the use of their veto, for example. They tend to be cautious about going into places that are in conflict, But if they perceive the situation as having changed, they'll also see both the economic and strategic opportunity here. And I think that has to be on the list of conditions.
So I'm running out of time here, but just briefly, what is the risk for al-Sharaa if he cuts a deal with the Russians? I mean, Russia was complicit with what Assad did, the killing of their own people. Does he have a risk internally with his own people if he cuts a deal, even if, say, he gets Assad extradited back to Syria? Does he have a risk there?
I think there certainly is a risk. How he perceives that risk, how big a risk he perceives it, compared to, say, the risk of dealing with Iran, is hard to say. But certainly there's a lot of sore feelings about the way Russia conducted itself, bombing hospitals and schools and things like that in Syria.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Singh.
FYI, for the committee, we heard the same thing from the Syrians, that the populace is not happy with either Iran or Russia, who conducted themselves very poorly in colluding with the Assad regime. So that's a good thing for us, for the people there getting that understanding. So with that,